I'm talking about what's good and bad about the Tobacco Products Directive. Before I start, I'm probably quite critical about things, but I'm not critical about the approach that Alette and Beryl are taking to being pragmatic about dealing with what they've got to deal with. So please take that. It's not a criticism of them at all. Right. What's right about it? What's right about the TPD? Basically, mainly what it isn't, which it's not a ban, it's not medical regulation, and it's not what the FDA is doing. And that really is about the happiest thing I can say about it. So that's the what's right bit dealt with. What's wrong? Okay. Basically, my contention is that the underlying policy is wrong here. We regulated too early with too much ignorance of the products, with too much inflexibility and too little ability to change it, with a very, very risk-averse approach that regarded these products as threats rather than opportunities. That's my summary. But let me just go back to the more formal basis for what's wrong, because this is what's underpinning the totally wicked legal case. EU legislation has to conform to a number of principles, and these are 4 of the principles, and these are the key 4 principles that are drawn on in the totally wicked case. Proportionality basically has to be sensible and reasonable in proportion to the risk. Non-discrimination, it mustn't treat one product differently to another if they're basically the same. It mustn't treat them the same if they're basically different. There must be a proper legal reason for EU action. That's a subsidiarity point. There has to be a legal base for it. It has to be sensible to do it at the EU level. And that's, in this case, about single market and free movement of goods. And people have rights to their property and to run a business. And legislators at the EU cannot just come in and destroy those willy-nilly. Okay? Deborah brought it up this morning, so I won't dwell on it, because first time there's been a policy evaluation of an e-cigarette policy. And this was the headline from the Washington Post. And it is the study that Deborah was mentioning earlier, which is that they measured the impact of a youth a ban on sales of e-cigarettes to under 18s. Now, it's contentious, this study. It's not definitive, and Deborah was right, so we shouldn't just rely on it. However, it does raise the key point and the theme of my presentation, which is about unintended consequences. So these state bans caused an increase in smoking in the places where there were bans compared to where there were not bans. And this was a large difference, according to this econometric study. So I want you to keep this in mind, that you can do things that you think are clever from a regulatory point of view, and they have unintended consequences that lead to more smoking, because that is going to be the story of the Tobacco Products Directive. So let me get into some of the areas where I think there's real problems and why I think they're going to cause unintended consequences. First of all, Beryl, the notification process, it's definitely not as heavy as licensing medicines. But what you have to remember is that some companies may have several hundred notifications to make. And one company I know has 1,150 to make. And there may be as many as 20 to 30,000 to make across the UK economy as a whole. I don't know who's going to be reading them or what they're going to do with that information, because that's far from clear. Who's got the time or, frankly, the willpower to read that much sort of guff about e-cigarettes? Okay, it is very, very detailed stuff. This is a picture from I can see people wincing who've looked at this. This is a picture, but there's devilment in this. You think it's just notifying the problem. Look at this. Here's an example, okay. Measurement methods to assess consistent dosing and nicotine uptake. That's something you have to fill in on this. Now, I got a sense there was going to be some pragmatism about that. That's good. But that is quite burdensome, potentially, if you've got many hundreds or dozens of products. Again, on ingredient disclosure, here's another one down at the bottom here. Upload files available on all the sort of toxicology, emissions, CMR, blah, blah, blah data. Okay, that potentially hundreds of ingredients. Interestingly, though, of course, it's the same ingredients that everyone else is using across the EU and across the UK, mostly manufactured in China. So huge amounts of paperwork duplication. The system has been designed incredibly badly. Not by the people doing it, by the way, but by the way this has been put together. And again, here's another bit of devilment. Quantity of emissions produced during the process of using the product. based on the measurement. There's no consistent way of measuring at the moment, so the data is basically meaningless. You've been forced to provide meaningless data that won't bear comparison with any other data. There's nothing that's requiring you to use a consistent methodology. We plough on. Advertising ban, okay. Alert showed what it was. Most advertising is banned. There's thankfully some left, and thankfully we're not doing what Scotland is doing. But what are the unintended consequences of banning advertising? A ban on advertising protects the incumbent, and the incumbent is cigarettes, the cigarette trade. It stops them building brands, building confidence, communicating innovation. It stops them appealing to customers to switch and come over. Okay? The unintended consequence is potentially more smoking. We banned tobacco advertising for a very good reason. 700,000 deaths a year from smoking in the EU, 0 deaths from using e-cigarettes, probably negative deaths when you look at lives saved. So what was the justification for giving the cigarette trade an incumbent advantage by banning the advertising of something that doesn't cause much harm? I call these pointless limitations. This is, I think, a form of bureaucratic harassment here, where larger containers are banned. No reason for that, just makes it more inconvenient, more likely that there'll be spillages, easier bottles to play with and mess around with. Here we're banning stronger liquids, possibly more useful for the more addicted smokers making the conversion, so perhaps they'll relapse more or not switch quite so successfully. Might be useful, concentrated liquids might be useful in future innovations focused on miniaturization. You might need the nicotine held in the smallest possible space. So you block off a route for innovation. That may stop future more attractive products being made, and therefore, in a sense, a protection of the cigarette trade. Another one, pointless, counterproductive this time. This is lifted directly from the regulations, incredibly ambiguous. E-cigarettes, the dose of nicotine must be delivered at consistent levels under normal conditions of use. Does that mean consistent through the experience of a single vape, consistent with the same product across different vapes, consistent according to the level of the battery charge, or consistent between batches, or what? And what's happened here is that legal uncertainty has been created, potentially enormous costs have been generated, because this has been lifted straight from the mindset of medicine regulation, where you do want to make sure that if you're delivering a drug to the central nervous system, it's delivered in predictable, accurate amounts. It's not a need that anyone in the vaping world ever expresses. Disproportionate warning. This is the warning that will go on, covering 30% of the packaging of these tiny bottles and devices. Actually, it goes on devices that don't even contain nicotine as well, just to be sort of doubly silly. Now, is that really the consumer message you want to put across if you're trying to approach this from a point of view of switching? Maybe you'd want to say, this product is not completely safe, but it's considerably safer than smoking. Or something like that. That would be meaningful, useful consumer information that would be actionable. This doesn't really take you anywhere, and by the way, it's wrong for the reasons that we heard. Nicotine itself is an addictive substance. It depends on the pK with which it's actually taken in. There's a leaflet in there. Here's the leaflet. That's the table of contents for the leaflet of the things. No leaflet in cigarettes that require you to say all of this stuff. So it's an additional burden. Pull out a leaflet, it'll be loaded full of scary stuff because lawyers will have been all over it. It's not going to have the effect of building confidence in these products relative to smoking. Cross-border, supposedly a free movement of goods directive. It's the most mismatch hodgepodge you could imagine. Different countries can do different things. There's all kinds of barriers to trade across borders, yet it's justified as a single market measure. I've sort of slightly greyed out the cross on this because each country, each member state can choose its own path on this. So again, we've got what is supposed to be a simplifying and harmonising measure to promote trade is actually a very messy, awkward, badly designed barrier to trade. Then there's things, there's a lot of people in this room know more about this than me, but there's a lot of things that the multiplicity of these effects, plus things like a leak-free refill mechanism, plus some of the things about tank size and so on, all of these things put together, do they potentially create a de facto ban or a massive restriction on these things? If you put all of those things together, because these will be products that are sold in relatively low volumes, They're very sort of specific, getting through the paperwork burdens, getting through the, the engineering and limitations and so on. Yet, these are the products that Anne and others research we know are the most effective. These are the ones we want to get people on. These are the ones that are treated most harshly in the regulation. Discrimination, this is another part of the Totally Wicked case. As I explained earlier, this comes from Court of Justice of the European Union ruling from ages ago. But comparable situations must not be treated differently. Different situations must not be treated the same unless such treatment is objectively justified. So Totally Wicked mentions 6 areas where the directive treats e-cigarettes unfairly, and that's or treats them the same or unfairly. Okay, and there's a whole load of stuff in this directive that is tougher on e-cigarettes than it is on cigarettes, and that is ridiculous. I want to talk the next phase of this. I want to talk about the process. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Says I've got 3 here. Consultation, justification, impact assessment. These are all elements of things that must be done. Okay. Consultation, this is just a joke really, because it reminds us that you have a consultation and then the decision makers do the basic opposite. So should we regulate e-cigarettes as medicines? That's what we tried to do from June 2013 onwards. Should the scope of the directive be extended? Resounding opposition to that. No, but that's not the real point of this. The real point of this is that these proposals have never been consulted on. Never been consulted on any of them. And this is the word count, going from the Commission proposal through to the Council General approach, then the historic overturning of the Council General approach and Commission proposal on the 8th of October, and then the Commission suggested text, and then the final Article 20 of the TPD. And then if you take in other articles like the cross-border trade one, you end up with essentially de novo legislation of several thousand words, depending on how you want to quantify it. And the interesting thing is that this is in effect a completely new legislative proposal that has not been through any of the legislative procedures that you're supposed to do. Consultation, I've just mentioned, I'm going to rush through this now. Justification, there are actual treaty requirements to justify these things properly. Try and find the justification for the measures that we're now wrestling with. It's absolutely wafer thin. Impact assessment, who's actually looked at all the costs and benefits of this legislative proposal? Answer is no one has, but it is actually a treaty requirement to do these things. They weren't done. And the reason they're a treaty requirement is you get better legislation if you do these things. Finally, scrutiny in national parliaments, something that's vexing David Cameron at the moment and is part of his Brexit letter to the President of the European Council. There's supposed to be national parliamentary scrutiny. Nobody's really looked at any of this in the UK Parliament. The thing that they looked at many months before it was agreed was something completely different. Advocate General opinion, we've heard about that. That's 17th, that's the key date. That's the one probably likely breakpoint or possible breakpoint. But I want to say what would, in the absence of it changing as a result of that, how would it change? There's a report built into the directive. No later than 5 years from 20th of May 2016, so that's 2021. You then have a report that has these terms of reference. If you just read those, you'll see how risk-averse they were in the thinking. It's like it could all go wrong. It's all going to be not that our policy is going to go wrong and ruin everything, but that these things are going to sort of hook children and everything. After that report, there would then be a new proposal and a new legislative process, and probably around 2025 or something like that at the earliest, we might see a new directive. So this is my summary. We had the wrong process, the wrong policy was emerged from the wrong process. That has led to bad legislation, and as far as changing it is concerned and doing anything about it, the final point is that's tough. You can't. Okay, thank you very much.